Have you ever had that really unsettling feeling that the pages of your life's calendar are being flipped by some unseen hand? You know what I mean. You blink and morning turns to evening, you blink again and an entire year is just gone. Days bleed into weeks, weeks into months, and suddenly it feels like you're strapped into this high-speed train where the scenery outside is nothing but a blur. Well, in today's Explainer, we're diving into some incredibly fascinating source material that bridges neuroscience, physics, and Islamic spirituality to answer a really profound question. Why exactly does our time seem to shrink as we age? And more importantly, how can we actually steal it back?
To really wrap our heads around this, let's look at a scenario I think we can all relate to. Think about your daily commute. Have you ever driven home, pulled your car into the driveway, and suddenly realized you have absolutely zero memory of the last 15 minutes? I mean, you didn't hit anything, you stopped at all the red lights, you made the right turns, but your conscious mind was just entirely absent. You were running on pure autopilot. When you look back at that drive, that time is just gone, completely erased from your mental hard drive.
Now, think about the stark contrast between our youth and where we are right now. Remember being 10 years old? That 2-month summer vacation from school felt like a sprawling, massive chapter of a novel. Actually, scratch that, it felt like a literal lifetime. You were having adventures, you rarely got bored, and a single year stretched out forever. But look at adulthood. Whether you're 25, 40, or 60, you celebrate the new year, you pay a couple of bills, scroll your phone a bit, and boom, the next new year's already here. The clock on the wall hasn't sped up. There are still exactly 365 days in a year, but your internal psychological experience of that time, it's been massively compressed. So why does this compression happen? Well, to get that, we have to look at how our understanding of time itself has evolved. For centuries, we kind of had it all wrong. Back in the 17th century, Isaac Newton pitched this idea of absolute time, basically arguing the universe is one giant clock ticking at the exact same rate for everyone, everywhere, a rigid cage. But then, in 1905, Einstein comes along and completely shatters that illusion with relativity, proving that time actually stretches and shrinks based on speed and gravity. But what the source material points out here is super interesting. Centuries before Einstein, the Quran was already presenting this concept of divine relativity. It describes a single divine day as being equal to 1,000 human years, or an ascent of angels taking 50,000 years. It laid out super early on that time is totally a matter of perspective and dimension. And that brings us to a third type of relativity, one that's happening right now, literally inside your head, psychological time relativity. And it's driven by a very specific neural culprit. Neuroscientists call it the default mode network, or the DMN. When you do routine tasks, your brain, which loves to save energy, basically shuts down your active conscious thought. It hands the wheel over to your subconscious autopilot. It's telling you, hey, I've seen this all before, nothing new to record here. Because of that, your brain just stops forming new, deep memories. You are physically awake, sure, but consciously, you're asleep. Because time isn't just what ticks by on a clock. Time is what your brain actually consciously processes. And man, this energy-saving mode is exactly what's driving the great digital heist of our era. Because this autopilot isn't just happening naturally anymore, it's being actively weaponized against us. The material highlights Tristan Harris, a former design director over at Google, who points out a really terrifying reality. Tech companies deliberately design their apps based on an asymmetric power relationship. Think about it. On one side of the glass is your single, tired, vulnerable brain. And on the other side, thousands of genius engineers backed by the world's most powerful supercomputers. And their one singular goal is to hack your default mode network and keep you hooked.
When their algorithms successfully hijack that DMN, you completely lose the ability to consciously process time. They numb your brain and trap you in this endless scrolling loop. I mean, this is exactly why you can sit down on the couch to watch just a few reels, and what feels like 15 minutes is actually 4 hours. That's 4 hours of your actual life just gone forever. Your perceived time literally shrinks down to zero because your consciousness was effectively knocked offline.
Now, the source material does something really elegant here. It bridges this exact neuroscience with Islamic spirituality. Because even our most sacred intentional acts fall victim to this autopilot. Have you ever stood up to pray, physically gone through every single motion perfectly, and then suddenly realized you have absolutely no idea what you just said because your mind was stressing about an email? You did the act, but you totally deleted the moment from your conscious memory. The Quran and Islamic tradition actually diagnose this exact state of living on unconscious autopilot as a profound spiritual disease. They call it ghafla, which translates to spiritual sleep or heedlessness. And that brings us to this incredibly chilling quote from Hazrat Ali, a revered figure in Islamic history. He said, "People are asleep, and when they die, they will wake up." The source really emphasizes this to elevate the stakes of what we're talking about. Ghafla isn't just some minor oopsie. It's a state where you have eyes, but you aren't really seeing, ears, but you aren't really hearing,
We tell ourselves we're busy, we're living these full lives by working and scrolling and hanging out, but we're basically sleepwalking. And this quote is a massive warning that the veil of this heedlessness will only be violently ripped away at the very end of our lives, showing us just how much time we squandered.
Okay, let's look at a highly relatable modern symptom of this ghafla. Ask yourself, what is modern humanity's absolute greatest fear? It's boredom. We are quite literally terrified of sitting alone in a silent room. Think about what happens the second the power goes out or your Wi-Fi drops. Total panic, right? We pace around the house, frantically toggling airplane mode on and off like an addict looking for a fix. Why are we so unbelievably restless without the internet? The material argues it's not because we're running from a lack of connection, it's because we're running from ourselves.
But neurobiologically, there's a totally different way to frame this boredom. When your screens go dark and your default mode network starts to crack in the silence, your inner voice is finally trying to wake you up. It starts asking those uncomfortable questions. Who are you? What is your actual purpose? And we usually run from that straight back to our phones. But boredom is not empty space. The very second we lose that drip of cheap dopamine, our brain aggressively starts searching for meaning. In Islamic terms, this silent discomfort is actually the gateway to tafakkur, or deep, creative reflection. It's an alarm clock, and it's ringing to wake you up.
And our constant fear of this silence fuels a terrifying mathematical reality that neuroscience calls the decreasing fraction. This perfectly explains the mechanics of why our time shrinks as our past gets bigger. Look, when you were 10 years old, one single year represents 10% of your entire existence on Earth. That is a massive chunk of data, so the year feels huge. But at age 20, a year is only 5% of your life. By the time you hit 50, a single year is a measly 2% of your existence. Every new year is just becoming a smaller and smaller drop in this massive ocean of your past, which forces your brain to perceive it as flying by incredibly fast.
And when you really do the math on this decreasing fraction, you hit an absolute gut punch of a statistic. Because the perceived speed of time basically halves every time your age doubles, by the time you reach 50 years old, a staggering 83% of your psychologically perceived life is already over. 83%. Just let that sink in for a second.
This trajectory right here, this mathematical curve, is the hidden, actual root of the famous midlife crisis. Look at these numbers. At just 20 years old, you've lived 50% of your psychological life. By 40, you are at 75%. So that sudden, frantic panic people hit in their 40s and 50s, it isn't just a movie cliché. It is a very real neurological panic. They're suddenly realizing their perceived time is almost entirely gone. And if you don't actively break out of the autopilot of ghafla, your brain is going to rush through whatever is left so fast, you won't even have time to brace yourself.
Okay, so how do we fight this? How do we switch the autopilot off? Well, if routine and heedlessness are stealing your time, the ultimate antidote is novelty and intense attention. When you break your daily routine and do something totally new, your brain gets jolted awake. It literally can't rely on the default mode network anymore. It has to process all this new data, which forms deep, high-resolution memories. So by injecting novelty in your life and just sitting with boredom without immediately grabbing your phone, you force your brain to actively record your life, which effectively stretches out your psychological time. And what's wild is that the source material points out this exact neurohack is embedded right into the core teachings of the Quran. It repeatedly commands readers to just observe the everyday worlds around them. Do they not look at the camels and at the heaven how it is raised? Now, why are you being asked to look at a sky or mountains that you've already seen a million times? Because it's a deliberate, active exercise to shatter your mental autopilot. When you deeply observe nature, you force your brain's executive network online. You're building new neural pathways. It's a literal, practical prescription to slow down your perception of time.
To put this into practice, the material gives a wonderfully simple yet profound tip for daily prayer. Right before you start, before you say the opening phrase, Allahu Akbar, just pause for 2 solid seconds. That's it. Use those 2 seconds to realize exactly where you are, what you're doing, and who you are standing before. Force your brain to be utterly present in that specific moment. That tiny 2-second anchor of consciousness is literally enough to rescue that entire experience from the void of autopilot and record it properly in your mind.
All of these concepts beautifully culminate in a short Quranic chapter called Surah Al-Asr, which is basically the ultimate framework for stopping this hemorrhage of our time. The chapter starts by swearing an oath by time itself, declaring that humanity is in a state of absolute loss, literally bleeding time with every tick of the clock. But then it gives a 4-step formula to stop the bleeding: faith, purposeful action, advocating for truth, and practicing patience. As the source explains, these aren't just religious checkboxes, they are conscious anchors. They are the deliberate, intentional actions that break the default routine and turn a rapidly declining asset into an eternal reality.
So let's wrap all this up. Physics tells us time is relentless. Neuroscience tells us perceived time is a product of our attention. And spiritual traditions tell us time is a sacred trust. You absolutely cannot stop the physical clock on the wall. You can't stop yourself from turning 30 or 50 or 80, but you do have absolute control over your psychological time. Don't let an algorithm compress your beautiful, complex existence into a single, blurry afternoon. So the question is, are you going to continue to sleepwalk through a shrinking life, or are you going to wake up, break the routine, and reclaim your time today?